Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something pretty complex but really important, environmental justice in Pakistan.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and we've got a lot to dig into.
We do. We've got this in-depth UNDP report to guide us, and we'll be looking at legal frameworks, too.
Judicial precedents, even some news articles that really bring the issue to life.
Exactly. So our mission today is to not just give you the facts, but to really help you grasp why environmental justice matters so much, specifically in the context of Pakistan.
And I think that why becomes clear as soon as you look at the state of the environment in Pakistan, right? I mean, this is a country that's ranked as the fifth most vulnerable to climate change globally.
Fifth.
Fifth. Yet, when you look at environmental performance,
Near the bottom of the list, isn't it?
second from the bottom. So there's a real disconnect there.
Yeah, you'd think those two things would be, more closely correlated.
You'd assume so, right? But the reality is that this low environmental performance is having serious consequences for people in Pakistan every single day.
We're talking about things like the devastating floods, the pollution levels, deforestation.
Absolutely. Water scarcity, huge issues that directly impact human security, especially for the most vulnerable communities.
And the UNDP report really highlights the 2022-2023 superfloods as a stark example of this. It wasn't just the scale of the disaster, it was who it hit hardest.
Yeah, and the report points out, for example, that 650,000 pregnant women and girls were among those affected by the floods, many without access to the health care they needed.
That's a staggering number.
It is, and it shows how these environmental crises don't impact everyone equally. Existing social inequalities, especially gender inequalities, get magnified during these events.
So it becomes an issue of justice, not just environmental protection.
Exactly.
Now, I understand that Pakistan actually has pretty strong environmental laws in place.
They do. The Pakistan Environmental Protection Act, the PP from 1997.
Right.
PIPA. It's a comprehensive piece of legislation, aligns with international standards. And then each province, since the 18th Amendment, adopted their own versions of PIPA.
So there's a framework there.
You've got that framework. You've also got the environmental protection agencies.
Right.
And then there are these specialized environmental tribunals designed to handle environmental cases. So on paper, it looks pretty solid.
Okay, so where's the disconnect then? Why, with all these laws and institutions, are we seeing this gap between policy and reality?
Well, that's where things get a little bit more complicated. A lot of it boils down to capacity and resources. These tribunals that are supposed to be delivering swift environmental justice, they're often non-functional.
Non-functional.
Yeah, because of delays in appointments.
So the very institutions designed to provide justice are just not working.
In many cases, yeah. There was a Dawn article that highlighted how the tribunal in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa wasn't even established for over a year after the Provincial EPA Act was passed. And in Sindh, the tribunal was reportedly inactive for 20 months because of vacancies. And this leads to a huge backlog of cases. And as we know, justice delayed is justice denied.
It's a system that seems to be struggling to live up to its potential. But what about the courts themselves? Have they recognized environmental rights?
This is where it gets interesting. Pakistani courts have actually been quite progressive in their interpretation of the right to a clean environment, like in the landmark Shilazia v. WAPG case.
Okay.
The court directly connected a clean environment to the fundamental right to life.
Interesting.
And then in another case, Asghar Laghari v. Federation of Pakistan, the court ruled that the government's inaction on climate change was a violation of that right.
So the legal basis for environmental justice is there.
It's there, but the implementation.
If these specialized tribunals are stalled, how do people actually seek justice for environmental harms?
That is the question, isn't it? Pakistan has these specialized green benches and green courts at different judicial levels,
Okay.
but their effectiveness is hampered by a number of things.
Yes.
Well, many of them aren't even functional. Still, lack of judges, lack of training in environmental law specifically.
So you might get your case heard, but the judge might not even fully understand the complexities of the issue.
Exactly. And these cases often involve scientific data, environmental regulations. It gets pretty complicated.
I was just looking at the UNDP report, and it mentions that while the Punjab Judicial Academy has a green desk for training, other provinces are lagging behind. So we've got these inconsistencies across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got that issue. But even if you have a judge who's well-versed in environmental law, you run into another obstacle: legal standing.
Standing. Remind me what that means in this context.
So it basically means not just anyone can sue over environmental damage they witness. It's not enough to just be upset about pollution. You have to prove you're directly affected by it.
You have to have skin in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, and you have to show that you've exhausted all other possible remedies.
So let's say there's a factory polluting a river near my house.
Mm.
I can't just take them to court because I'm angry about it.
Not that simple, unfortunately. You'd have to prove that the pollution from that specific factory is directly impacting you or your property, and that you've tried other things, like reporting the pollution to the authorities.
That seems like a pretty high bar to clear.
It is. It creates a significant barrier, especially for marginalized communities who may not have the resources or know how to navigate that legal system.
And this is where a case like the Lahore Canal Bank Road case becomes important, right?
Exactly.
Because it set a precedent that can be difficult for ordinary citizens to challenge.
Right. In that case, the court ruled that cutting down trees for road widening was acceptable. And their reasoning was based on these expert reports, which, are likely commissioned by the government or developers involved in the project.
So those reports, while they might be valid, they can also be used to justify actions that harm the environment and potentially silence the concerns of local communities.
Absolutely. It becomes very difficult for individuals or communities to raise their voices when powerful entities can point to these expert reports to back up their actions.
It sounds like even with progressive legal interpretations in these specialized courts, the path to environmental justice in Pakistan is still.
It's riddled with obstacles.
Yeah.
And the system, in theory, is there. But the actual experience of trying to seek environmental justice is just far more complex.
Yeah.
And a lot of that complexity comes from another layer of the problem we need to look at. The lack of coordination between different government bodies, the ones responsible for environmental protection in Pakistan. It's a big hurdle.
So we're talking about like an institutional challenge on top of the legal ones we've been discussing.
Yeah, exactly. You have various federal ministries, provincial departments, the EPAs,
Right.
all these entities often working in silos. So you end up with this duplication of effort, sometimes even working at cross purposes, and very little actual impact on the ground.
It's like a bureaucratic maze. Everyone's lost in their own department. Isn't there supposed to be some kind of central authority, someone who's, overseeing environmental policy as a whole?
Well, in theory, there are mechanisms for coordination, but the UNDP report gives this really striking example from Balochistan. Apparently, the Women's Development Department and the Commission on the Status of Women, they both did their own separate gender assessments of the water policy.
Wait, are you serious? So they didn't even realize that the Environmental Protection and Climate Change Department was already doing work on that.
It's a classic case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. And that kind of lack of communication, lack of coordination, it leads to wasted resources, conflicting policies.
And ultimately, a weaker response to these environmental challenges the country's facing.
Exactly.
So how do you fix that? How do you go from this fragmented system, all these silos, to something that can actually deliver environmental justice?
Well, the UNDP report does offer some solutions, and it's not like you need to completely overhaul the system. I mean, starting with the environmental tribunals and those green benches we talked about,
Right.
Streamline the appointment process, make sure they're actually functional.
Staffed with qualified people who can actually handle the caseload.
Exactly. That's a crucial first step.
Get them up and running. Make sure they're not just empty shells. What else?
Empowering the EPAs, the environmental protection agencies, that's another key area. They need the resources to do their job.
Using the teeth.
The training, the personnel, so they can actually monitor compliance, gather evidence, and enforce the regulations that are already there.
Give them the tools to do their job, basically.
Right. And then there's the issue of jurisdiction. For those green benches and courts, we need clear guidelines. What kinds of cases can they handle? Removing any ambiguity or overlap in jurisdiction is going to make the system much more efficient.
Clearer definitions, sharper lines of responsibility. Sounds like a good way to avoid unnecessary delays and confusion.
Definitely. But maybe the most important aspect, the one that underpins all these other reforms, is empowering those environmental human rights defenders and ensuring public participation in these environmental decisions.
This is where the voices of those communities we talked about earlier really come into play, right?
Yeah, the ones who are most affected by this environmental degradation, they need a seat at the table. Their input is absolutely crucial when you're crafting solutions that are actually effective and just. And the report talks a lot about the threats, the exclusion that these environmental human rights defenders often face.
Despite the fact that they're often the ones in the front line.
Absolutely. They're trying to protect the environment. They're trying to protect their
It's
communities.
like trying to solve a puzzle
Hmm.
with only half the pieces. You need those diverse perspectives. You need those lived experiences to see the whole picture and to come up with solutions that actually work.
Right. And when those voices are silenced, it's not just about fairness.
Hmm.
It also undermines the effectiveness of any environmental protection efforts.
So it's really about creating a system that's both just
Yeah.
and functional.
Right.
One that recognizes those rights, but also has the institutions capable of delivering change.
Exactly. That's the ultimate goal. And, to get to that point, to really achieve true environmental justice in Pakistan, it's going to require a pretty fundamental shift. And it's not just about the laws and the courts, it's about how we value the environment as a whole and those who are being affected by its degradation.
That's a pretty monumental task, isn't it? Shifting mindsets, empowering communities, reforming institutions, a lot to take on.
It is a lot, but it's not insurmountable. The report talks about how even small steps like mandatory training for judges on environmental law can make a big difference.
Right. Give them the tools they need to understand these complex cases. And the report also talks a lot about the importance of access to information,
Right.
making sure that communities have the data they need to understand what's happening.
Absolutely. Transparency,
Transparency.
informed decision-making. You can't have accountability without that.
Right. And there's another key player here that we haven't mentioned yet, the private sector.
Oh, absolutely.
They have a huge role to play in upholding environmental human rights. It can't all fall on the government.
Oh,
like that.
exactly. The report talks about how businesses need to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence, make sure their operations aren't part of the problem, and that they're taking steps to mitigate any negative impacts.
So it's about going beyond just following the letter of the law, integrating environmental considerations into every aspect of business, from supply chains to waste management, corporate responsibility, not just compliance.
Right. And that kind of comprehensive approach is what we need to see across the board. It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about everyone working together, government, civil society, the private sector, to create a more just and sustainable future.
So it sounds like getting to true environmental justice in Pakistan, it requires action on like all these different levels.
It does, yeah.
You've got the legal reforms, you need to strengthen those institutions, empower communities.
Bring in corporate responsibility. It's not just one solution. It's like this whole ecosystem that needs to change.
So, thinking about everyone listening, if you were advising, let's say, the Pakistani government, where would you tell them to start? What would be your top priority if you really wanted to see environmental justice become a reality?
If I had to pick just one thing, I'd say tackling that coordination problem we talked about.
Right.
Breaking down those silos between all the different departments.
Because right now it's like,
Getting everybody working together toward the same goal. Because if you don't have that foundation of collaboration, even the best policies in the world are going to struggle.
right, it's like you're trying to conduct an orchestra where everyone's playing a different tune. You need that conductor to bring it all together.
Exactly. You've got to have that harmony within the government itself. And then you can extend that to civil society, to the private sector, but you've got to start with that base level of, okay, we're all working together, we're all on the same page. That's how you create a system that can deliver environmental justice for everyone in Pakistan.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive, I have to say. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is really just the start of the conversation, right?
It is, yeah.
There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn about this.
And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what environmental justice means in the context of Pakistan, the challenges, the
And
opportunities.
solutions, hopefully.
Yeah, the solutions. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for that more just and sustainable future. Thanks for joining us.